The stadium was supposed to be a cathedral of order. Every angle polished, every second choreographed, every sound checked and double-checked. But then the cameras cut to the big screen, and in an instant, the illusion shattered. Donald Trump's face filled the arena, and before the image even settled, a roar surged, not of applause, not of reverence, but of resistance. Boos, loud and relentless, poured like thunder through the court. It wasn't just noise, it was defiance, raw and unfiltered, rising from the crowd in waves. For a split second, the broadcasters hesitated. Should they cut the feed? Should they mute the truth? The USTA had pleaded for silence, for discretion, for control. But truth doesn't wait for permission. The microphones caught every note of dissent, every voice that refused to be quiet. On screens across the world, millions watched as order collapsed into reality. The carefully crafted image of power gave way to something the establishment could not script, a crowd reminding a president and a system that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. And then, piercing through the chaos, came the moment that transformed noise into history. Laura Robson, her voice steady, unafraid, broke the invisible wall. "They've just shown Trump on the big screen, lots of boos," she said. Not an observation, but a revelation. She spoke what the cameras showed, what the crowd declared, what the officials wanted buried. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the whole world exhaled. Someone had named the truth. Someone had refused to look away. But if one sentence could ripple through millions, what would happen when the full story behind those boos came crashing into daylight? Asterisk behind the shine of the court and the hum of anticipation, there had been whispers all week. A memo, circulated quietly among broadcasters and production crews, carried the unmistakable fingerprints of fear. The United States Tennis Association had one request, simple in its wording, heavy in its implications: refrain from showcasing any disruptions or crowd reactions to the president's appearance. In other words, the cameras could show the power, but not the people. For the USTA, this was about optics. The men's final of the US Open was one of the most watched sporting events in the world, a spectacle broadcast into millions of homes, a jewel of American sports culture. Into that spotlight would step Donald Trump, a man who thrived on domination of the narrative. The organizers feared the unpredictable. They feared that the crowd, the living, breathing heart of the game, not play along, and so, they tried to script silence. But the anxiety wasn't just about one night. It was about the symbolism of the event itself. The US Open, historically, had been a celebration of diversity, of global talent converging on American soil. Legends from every continent had made their mark there, their triumphs woven into a tapestry bigger than sport. To censor the voices of its audience, to muffle dissent, was more than just stage management. It was a betrayal of that spirit. The stakes stretched beyond the baseline and the umpire's chair. What does it mean when a governing body of sport bends to political pressure? What does it mean when a moment of truth, millions of voices rising in unison, treated as a liability to be managed rather than a reality to be honored? At its core, this wasn't about tennis, it was about transparency, integrity, and whether institutions built on the promise of fairness could be trusted when it mattered most. The broadcasters knew the weight of their decision: obey the directive, and they would shield the president from the people's judgment, but at the cost of their own credibility. Defy it, and they risked backlash, strained partnerships, even their future rights to cover the sport. And in that tension, the air in every control room grew heavy. The match itself suddenly felt like the least important battle being fought that night. Meanwhile, viewers at home had no idea of the drama unfolding off-court. Families gathered in living rooms. Fans tuned in from bars and phones and laptops. Across the globe, they weren't just watching a match. They were watching a national stage, a mirror of American identity. And in that mirror, millions waited to see not just who would win a trophy, but whether honesty would survive the broadcast. The USTA's gamble was clear: silence the boos, and perhaps the headlines would stay clean, unruffled, safe. But silence has a cost. Silence corrodes trust. Silence tells the audience their voices don't matter, their reactions aren't real, their presence is decoration, not participation. And so, when the boos broke through, when microphones betrayed the memo, when Laura Robson's words carried the sound across the world, the moment became bigger than the match. It was no longer about a tennis crowd's disapproval. It was about whether an institution sworn to celebrate sport would stand for its own values, or collapse under the weight of politics. Because if a sporting body could hide the boos of a crowd, what else could be hidden? And if truth could be muted here, on the world's stage, what did that mean for the battles yet to come? For over a century, the United States Tennis Association has cast itself as a steward of the game, polished, proud, and progressive. Its history is woven with stories of transformation. It was the USTA that celebrated Arthur Ashe, the barrier-breaking champion whose name now adorns the stadium where this very drama unfolded. It was the USTA that leaned into the image of inclusivity, of a sport that could belong to anyone, no matter their race, gender, or background. On paper, it was an institution that thrived on openness, but legacies are fragile things. For every tale of progress, there lingers the temptation to control. The USTA has long been known as a guardian of decorum, eager to maintain tennis as the gentleman's game, as the sport of civility and elegance. That veneer of control often meant smoothing over rough edges, keeping the spotlight clean, ensuring the product presented to the world was as polished as the courts themselves. And in moments of turbulence, that instinct for order has clashed with the messy reality of public expression. The truth is, the USTA has always existed in tension between two identities, the champion of progress and the gatekeeper of tradition. It was proud to show Billie Jean King fighting for women's equality, but nervous when her advocacy spilled into the political. It was quick to celebrate Serena Williams as the embodiment of modern greatness, but uneasy when her emotions on court disrupted the decorum they prized. Each time, the institution had to decide: stand with the raw truth of its players and fans, or retreat into stage management. And so, when the news came that Donald Trump would be attending the final, the USTA's reflex for control kicked in. Trump wasn't just another spectator. He was a political figure whose presence guaranteed volatility. The USTA's leadership feared not just disruption in the stands, but the optics of that disruption reaching millions of screens. Their response was textbook: issue a directive, control the narrative, suppress the unpredictable. In their mind, it was about protecting the sport's image. Yet here lies the contradiction that makes the USTA the perfect villain of this story. The same organization that once trumpeted its role in advancing civil rights on the court now chose censorship off it. The same association that points to its diverse champions as proof of progress now sought to muzzle the most democratic expression of all, the collective voice of its audience. That's why this wasn't just about one night of booze. It was about hypocrisy. It was about a body that wanted to bask in the glow of progressivism while quietly silencing the parts of progress that made it uncomfortable. By trying to hide the discontent of the crowd, the USTA revealed its deeper fear that truth, once unmuted, is uncontrollable. And the irony: their attempt at suppression only magnified the moment. Audiences around the globe don't remember the matches where everything went according to script. They remember the disruptions, the ruptures, the moments when the mask slipped and reality poured through. By issuing that memo, by trying to sanitize the roar of the people, the USTA made those boos bigger than they ever could have been on their own. This is the paradox of institutions built on control. The harder they try to silence, the louder dissent becomes. The USTA wanted to guard the sanctity of its stage, but instead, it exposed its own fragility. The association that once celebrated Ashen King, symbols of fearless truth, was now reduced to fearing the sound of its own audience. And so, in this story, the USTA is not just an organizer of a tournament. It is the embodiment of a choice every institution faces: to embrace authenticity or to smother it. By choosing censorship, it became the foil against which courage could shine. Because villains in these dramas are never born in the shadows. They are made in the spotlight when their contradictions are revealed for the world to see. But if the USTA's hypocrisy set the stage for conflict, the question remained: who would dare to challenge them in real time, live on air, with millions watching? Long before Laura Robson's voice cut through the carefully constructed silence of the US Open broadcast, she had already lived a life shaped by defiance and resilience. Hers was not the path of the polished prodigy who coasted effortlessly to the top. Hers was the story of a fighter, of someone who carried both the weight of expectation and the grit of someone determined to write her own narrative. Born in Australia but raised in Britain, Robson entered the tennis world as a prodigy. Her left-handed forehand carving through opponents with a blend of power and finesse rare for someone so young. She was crowned Wimbledon junior champion at just 14 years old, hailed as the next great hope for British tennis. But with that spotlight came pressure, injury, and relentless scrutiny. She learned early that fame is fickle, that applause can turn to doubt, that headlines can cut as sharply as they can crown. And yet, she never retreated. Her professional career was marked by flashes of brilliance: Olympic silver alongside Andy Murray, victories over top-ranked stars that proved she belonged on the grandest stages. But it was also marked by setbacks, wrist surgeries, comebacks that fizzled before they could take fire, the ache of a career shortened before its peak. To some, that might have read as unfinished business. To Laura, it was the foundation of something else: perspective. She knew what it meant to stand in the storm of expectation. She knew what it meant to be silenced by circumstances beyond her control. And perhaps most importantly, she knew the value of honesty in a world built on image. When her playing days shifted into punditry, she didn't carry herself like a retired star basking in nostalgia. She spoke with the candor of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to say. Viewers grew to trust her because she didn't hide behind platitudes or soften her words to fit a sponsor's script. She was analytical, yes, but also fearless in calling things as they were. In an industry often obsessed with keeping commentary safe, her credibility came from refusing to sugar coat. And that credibility mattered on the night Donald Trump's face appeared on the Jumbotron. Laura Robson wasn't just another commentator. She was someone whose career had been built on authenticity, whose hardships had carved away pretense, whose audience tuned in because they knew she would speak truth. That night, she didn't calculate the risk of breaking the USTA's directive. She simply told the truth as she saw it. They've just shown Trump on the big screen, lots of boos. It was a small sentence, but its weight came from the woman who spoke it. Anyone else might have ignored it, passed it off with a nervous laugh, or pivoted back to the match. But Laura Robson had lived too long in the shadow of silence. She knew the cost of suppression, whether it was her own body forcing her off the court, or an institution trying to mute an audience. Speaking up wasn't a stunt. It was muscle memory. And in that moment, she became something larger than a pundit. She became the embodiment of the very values sport claims to cherish: courage, integrity, and fairness. For millions watching, she wasn't just describing boos. She was validating them, affirming that the crowd's voice mattered as much as the spectacle on the court. She was telling every viewer at home who heard those gears and wondered if they were allowed to notice. Yes, you heard it too. Yes, it happened. Yes, the truth deserves to be spoken. Laura Robson's backstory isn't one of unbroken triumph. It's one of resilience, loss, authenticity, and rebirth. And that's what made her defiance so powerful. Because when someone who has endured silence decides to speak, the words cut deeper, ring louder, last longer. But what happens when that voice, clear and unshaken, collides head-on with the live tension of the match, when commentary becomes confrontation, and silence becomes impossible to maintain? The match should have been the center of gravity, two world-class athletes circling the baseline, the crowd's energy sharpening every serve, every volley. But then the camera cut, a flash of orange skin, familiar hair, and suddenly the air itself changed. A ripple first, then a roar, boos crashing down like thunder rolling across Arthur Ashe. The sound was unmistakable, raw, visceral, yet inside the broadcast truck, producers panicked. The memo from the USTA was clear: no commentary on politics, no mention of what the microphones couldn't fully drown out. Silence was the weapon, control was the strategy. But silence has a way of making truth louder. For long seconds, the commentators followed the directive, narrating around the storm. "The energy is electric here tonight," one muttered, a hollow filler line that rang false against the rising tide of audience fury. The boos weren't going anywhere. If anything, they were swelling decibels, breaking through the engineered calm. And then, Laura Robson leaned forward. Her voice, when it came, was steady, almost deceptively calm. "You can hear it," she said, not with malice, not with glee, but with honesty. "That's not applause. That's New York, making itself heard." For a beat, time froze. Her words cut through the broadcast like a shard of glass against silk. The directive shattered in real time, the forbidden truth laid bare. Viewers at home felt the release instantly. Someone on the inside, a trusted former pro, wasn't pretending. She wasn't afraid to name what millions could hear with their own ears. The camera operators hesitated. One stayed fixed on the court, desperately trying to maintain normalcy, while another almost rebellious band back to the crowd, capturing faces twisted in anger, pride, defiance. The truth had escaped containment. Inside the control room, chaos. Headsets crackled, producers barked, "Get her off it, steer back, focus on the game." But out in the open air, Robson sat upright, shoulders squared, the picture of composure. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to editorialize. Her authority came from restraint, from the unshakable fact that she spoke what was already undeniable. It was a collision of worlds. On one side, the USTA's shadowy directive, born from fear of alienating donors, sponsors, political power. On the other, a lone pundit who understood her responsibility not as loyalty to management, but as fidelity to the audience, to the principle of honesty. And the crowd, sensing the fracture, only grew louder. The boos became chants, their rhythm syncing with the pounding hearts of millions watching. Social media ignited within seconds, clips recorded on phones from the stands, already racing across timelines, captions blazing. "They're trying to hide it, but Laura said it." Trump, for once, wasn't the central spectacle. He sat, stony-faced, shifting in his seat as cameras lingered too long on the optics of rejection. The real story was elsewhere, a broadcaster defying the script, piercing the manufactured veil, every second dragged into eternity. Every word Robson spoke against the silence, a small act of rebellion. And though the match eventually resumed, the illusion of control never quite returned. The audience had tasted unfiltered reality, and the USTA's attempt to choreograph perception had crumbled live under the weight of one simple, steady observation. Robson hadn't just broken the directive, she had rewritten the night's narrative. and everyone from the viewers at home to the nervous executives watching from glass offices knew that the balance of power had shifted, if only by a few sentences. The silence was broken. But what would the cost be? It was the kind of sentence that barely registered in length, yet thundered in impact. Just 3 words, spoken in Laura Robson's crisp tone, but enough to rip through layers of choreography and silence. Lots of booze, no embellishment, no spin, just fact, delivered like a mic drop. And once it was said, there was no taking it back. For a moment, the broadcast seemed to stutter. The crowd noise surged against the headsets. Every hiss and jeer magnified in contrast to the sterile commentary that had preceded it. The USTA's carefully constructed wall of neutrality cracked wide open, and millions of living rooms across the world suddenly felt more alive, more honest. On social media, the clip was already taking flight. Someone had captured it, clipped, subtitled it, and shared it with a caption blazing across timelines. Laura Robson just said what we were all hearing. The speed of virality defied containment. Within minutes, hashtags bloomed, hashtag lots of booze, hashtag Robson said it, hashtag us open truth. The words became more than commentary. They became a rallying cry. Inside the control room, faces drained pale. Producers slammed buttons, shifted cameras, whispered frantic directives into earpieces, moved back to the baseline, tighten the shot, cut the crowd mics. But it was too late. The spell of silence had been broken, and no amount of post-production gymnastics could reweave it. Back on air, her co-commentators tried to smooth the surface. One chuckled nervously, another pivoted clumsily back to the match. Well, it's certainly a lively atmosphere tonight. Their voices sounded tinny, artificial, standing in stark relief against Robson's authenticity, and viewers noticed. People always notice, because Robson hadn't screamed. She hadn't editorialized, she had simply validated what the audience already knew was true. That was the genius and the danger of her choice. By confirming reality, she exposed the network's attempt to distort it. The crowd, meanwhile, seemed to hear her too. Chants sharpened, as if emboldened by her acknowledgement. What had been a wave of boos now took on a steady rhythm. A protest scored to the heartbeat of Arthur Ashe Stadium. Camera lenses scanned rows of spectators, catching raised fists, shaking heads, and unbothered smiles. A collective performance of dissent, amplified by the commentator who dared to name it. The market felt it almost instantly. On Twitter, ESPN's stock mentions surged. Debates flared on cable news scrolls before the match had even finished. Advertisers who prided themselves on authenticity began calculating their alignment. Would they side with the USTA's attempt at censorship, or with the raw honesty Robson had unleashed? By dawn the next morning, numbers told the story. Clips of the moment eclipsed highlights of the actual match. Searches for Laura Robson, booze Trump dwarfed the names of the athletes who had fought on court. The narrative had shifted entirely. A night meant to showcase tennis had become a referendum on truth, perception, and power. But in that live moment, as the crowd thundered, the tension was unbearable. Every second after her words carried the weight of possible fallout. Would she be cut off mid-sentence? Would producers mute her mic, edit her from the replay, pretend she hadn't said it? The suspense wasn't just in the match, it was in watching a woman walk the tightrope between integrity and institution, balance on it, and dare not to fall. What made it resonate so deeply was her history. Robson wasn't a firebrand chasing headlines. She was a former pro, a trusted voice, someone who knew the game inside out. That credibility gave her words gravity. To dismiss her would be to dismiss the intelligence of the audience itself. And that was a battle no network could win. Commentators across the Atlantic began weighing in within hours. A BBC pundit tweeted, "Robson said what everyone was thinking. That's called integrity." Others followed. What had been 3 casual words were now being dissected on panels, retweeted with fire emojis, celebrated as an unmasking of hypocrisy. The USTA, scrambling, issued no immediate statement. Their silence only fueled speculation. Were they furious, embarrassed, prepared a reprimand, or quietly acknowledging that one woman's candor had rescued the broadcast from ridicule? The suspense hung heavy because viewers knew they had witnessed something unscripted, uncontainable. In an era when politics often feel prepackaged and even sport is engineered for optics, that kind of raw truth is intoxicating. And Robson's words echoed like a refrain. Fans repeated them online, layering them onto memes, remixing them into videos with dramatic music, sharing them with captions like when someone finally says the quiet part out loud. The simplicity made it versatile. The honesty made it viral. Trump himself, uncharacteristically, did not respond that night. Cameras had caught his tight jaw, his refusal to react. But silence from him only amplified the significance. If the man built on spectacle couldn't control the narrative, then Robson's mic drop had done more than defy a directive. It had shifted the balance of power, however briefly, in the most public arena. That's why the moment mattered. Not because of the boos themselves, they've happened before. not because of Trump's presidency's weathered protest plenty, but because the institution tasked with delivering sport had tried to mute reality. And one voice, unshaken, refused to comply. Her words now lingered in the air, replayed on loop, etched into headlines. Lots of booze. A small phrase, but in that fragile balance between truth and theater. It carried the force of a revolution. And as the night wound down, with the match finally concluded and the crowd dispersing, the question remained. What would the repercussions be for Robson, for the USTA, for the integrity of live sport itself? The booze had been undeniable. The truth had been spoken. The world had heard. And now, everyone was waiting for the fallout. Asterisk. The match was over, but the story had only just begun. As the last ball was struck and the scoreboard locked in place, another contest far louder, far longer, was unfolding across screens and feeds worldwide. And at the center of it was not the players on court, but Laura Robson, and the three words that had slipped past the USTA's grip. Within hours, clips of her commentary had been spliced, subtitled, and shared across every platform imaginable. On TikTok, one video looped her voice, lots of boos against the thunder of the crowd, overlaid with text that read, "Truth greater than silence." It amassed 1 million views before sunrise. On Twitter, journalists and fans alike pushed it into trending territory. Hashtag lots of boos, hashtag Robson said it, and hashtag STA silence became rallying cries. Proof that authenticity still had an audience hungry to devour it. The commentary from pundits was immediate and sharp. Former athletes, many who had once called Robson a peer, praised her courage. "That's leadership," tweeted Billie Jean King, the legend who had once fought her own battles against silence in tennis. Espino's morning panel replayed the clip with something close to awe. "You hear it, right there. No spin, just the truth. That's why it hit," one analyst declared, as footage rolled again, the boos echoing in the studio. Even outside the sport, cultural commentators weighed in. A New York Times columnist framed Robson's words as a quiet revolution in an age of managed reality. A podcaster described it more bluntly. "She broke the matrix." And while the establishment hesitated, the crowd validated her in real time. Fans who had been in Arthur Ashe that night began posting shaky phone videos, proving the volume of the boos. They tagged Robson with captions like, "Thanks for saying what we were screaming." What had begun as dissent in a stadium now morphed into solidarity online, a collective chorus defending honesty. The backlash aimed at the USTA was fierce. Calls for accountability spilled across forums and headlines. Why had the directive been issued to sanitize commentary? Who decided silence was safer than truth? Editorial boards raised the uncomfortable question. Had the USTA, an organization built on the language of inclusivity, betrayed its own principles in favor of political expediency? And then came the most telling reaction. Laughter. Memes painted the USTA as a desperate stage manager, frantically trying to cut mics while the audience roared louder. One viral clip showed a man futilely holding a pillow over a blaring speaker, captioned "Us TA producers during Robson's mic drop." The humor sharpened the criticism. Once mocked, institutions rarely regain control. Robson herself, notably, stayed quiet after the match. She didn't issue a statement, didn't post a victory lap. That silence only magnified the dignity of her live moment. She had said just enough when it counted. The rest, she seemed to understand, was for the public to carry forward. And carry it forward they did. Fans in London painted banners with her words and hung them outside local courts. In New York, graffiti scrawled across subway walls repeated the phrase. The echo chamber wasn't confined to tennis, it had spilled into politics, culture, even late-night comedy. One monologue opened with, "They tried to hide the boos." Laura Robson said, "Nah, we hear you. That's the energy I want in my life." Through it all, the emotional center held firm. What audiences celebrated wasn't just a dig at Trump or a shot at the USTA. It was something more universal. The validation of lived reality. Millions had heard the boos. Millions knew what they meant. To acknowledge them was to acknowledge the power of collective voice. In that validation, Robson became more than a pundit. She became a symbol, however briefly, of what it means to stand firm when institutions falter, not with rage or grandstanding, but with honesty, with words so spare they could be written on a protest sign, repeated in a whisper, or shouted in a crowd. Lots of boos. 3 words that reminded the world. Sometimes truth doesn't need amplification. It only needs someone brave enough to say it aloud. And, as the conversation escalated, one question burned hotter than all the others. If a single commentator could puncture the silence, what might happen when others decide to follow? The answer would shape not only the future of tennis broadcasts, but the broader fight between truth and control. Asterisk in the end. It wasn't the scoreboard that defined the night. It wasn't the forehands or backhands, the aces or unforced errors. It was a choice, a single, human choice between silence and truth. Between playing along with quiet suppression or daring to name what everyone could already hear. The USTA had chosen optics. They had chosen to tuck reality into a corner, to preserve the illusion that sport could somehow float above the noise of politics and protest. But their silence rang hollow. It wasn't neutrality, it was erasure, and audiences, in their bones, recognized it. Laura Robson chose differently. She chose honesty. She chose the dignity of acknowledging the crowd, the courage of saying aloud what the microphones captured and what every viewer at home could sense. She chose the public truth. And in doing so, she reminded millions of something far bigger than a tennis match. Authenticity is stronger than optics, because the truth doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need spin, or choreography, or memos crafted in the shadows. The truth can live in 3 words, delivered calmly, without flourish. Lots of booze. Simple, steady, undeniable. That contrast is what lingers. The attempt at quiet suppression, with its nervous directives and cutaway cameras, looks small, insecure, fragile. Robson's honesty, by contrast, felt vast. It stood tall, because dignity always does. It reminded us that courage isn't always loud, it's consistent. It's choosing clarity when distortion would be easier, and the crowd knew it. That's why their cheers for her honesty outlasted the jeers for Trump. That's why her name trended higher than the champions she once played alongside. Because people aren't hungry for perfection. They're hungry for someone who reflects their reality back at them, without fear. In this moment, the lesson is clear. Institutions may cling to control. Politicians may demand deference. But authenticity, real, unvarnished authenticity, still holds power. It sparks solidarity. It builds trust. It reminds us of our shared dignity. Laura Robson didn't break the silence with anger or venom. She broke it with truth. And in a world where so much is manufactured, that was enough to inspire millions. The night at the US Open will be remembered not only for its booze, but for the courage it took to say they existed. That's the legacy of authenticity. When others suppress, when others manipulate, when others hide, the simple act of honesty becomes revolutionary. And so, the story ends with a reminder not about sport, not about politics, but about us. When we choose dignity over fear, when we honor reality instead of burying it, we do more than speak the truth. We keep it alive. So tonight, we return to where it all began, with that headline, with that choice. Laura Robson defies US Open. Ordered by commenting on Donald Trump booze. A directive told her to stay quiet. A culture of optics told her to look away. But courage told her otherwise. And in that instant, clarity triumphed. Because this story isn't just about Laura Robson. It's about the values we choose in our own lives. Do we bend to silence when truth feels inconvenient? Or do we stand steady, even when the stakes are high? Robson showed us that honesty doesn't have to roar, it only has to be spoken. And when it is, it can ripple across millions, sparking solidarity, laughter, outrage, and most importantly, hope. That's why her moment matters. That's why we remember it now. And that's why you watching this have a role to play. If you believe truth should never be muted, share this story. Subscribe to this channel so voices like this are never lost in the noise. And most of all, carry that courage into your own sphere. Because authenticity isn't just contagious, it's unstoppable.